Lower Decks might be the most paradoxical Star Trek series of the so-called New Trek collection under the helm of Alex Kurtzman. While Discovery and Picard have been blackballed by a certain subset of the fandom for not being real Trek, whatever that means, many of those same people have welcomed Lower Decks with open arms. This despite it being the first show to eschew the 60-minute sci-fi drama format in favor of a 30-minute animation since the animated series first aired in 1973. But unlike the animated series, Lower Decks is not intended to be a children's show. Headed by Rick and Morty veteran Mike McMahon, Lower Decks is a comedy series primarily targeted at adults moving from one crude joke to the next at warp speed.
I must update you on my many sexual conquests, Mariner.
What, both of them?
Given all of that, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Lower Decks is the most deconstructive entry in the franchise since Deep Space Nine. And for the most part, you'd be right. But, paradoxically, it also might be the safest entry in the franchise. Why that all adds up to the show being the most popular entry of the current Trek universe among fans and skeptics alike honestly deserves its own discussion. But for now, let's focus on how Lower Decks succeeds in deconstructing the core themes and tropes of Star Trek, and how it falls short. Fair warning, major spoilers for Lower Decks Season 1 ahead. Let's start with the core premise of the show, that being its focus on how the sausage is made in the Federation. Star Trek has its origins as a Western set in space, following a crew of explorers as they expand the frontier to seek out new life and new civilizations. Lower Decks, in contrast, spent the course of Season 1 focusing not on how the Federation grows, but how it is maintained. This is true on both the micro and macro levels. We see our crew members lubing the turbo lift, cleaning the waste collectors in the holodeck, and getting excited about aligning EPS conduits.
Well, if you see an unaligned EPS conduit, don't call me. Mine are aligned as hell.
But we also see them revisit familiar locations and species from the Trek universe, and seeing how history unfolded after the episode ended. It's here where Lower Decks really begins to shine and deconstruct the enlightened utopia of the Federation that Trek usually presents. When the Cerritos visits Beta 3, a planet visited by Kirk and company more than 100 years prior, who found the inhabitants worshipping a sentient computer named Landru that demanded obedience, suppressed creativity, and made them attack each other during the Purge-style Red Hour, they find that decades of the Federation ignoring the Baetans has left them reverting to their old ways and worshipping Landru again.
I can't believe you all started re-worshipping the dang computer.
Well, Landru is very persuasive.
Consume the intruders! Obey Landru!
Hey, don't make me paradox you into destroying yourself.
Landru apologizes!
As Captain Freeman mentions, Starfleet's policy of some intervention is leading societies to revert to old ways or be conquered by other societies.
Nothing against second contact missions, but the Cerritos should be popping in on those legacy civilizations before they unravel.
Yeah, but popping in is against regulation. We would need specific orders.
I just hate seeing a perfectly good society get destroyed by a gamester of Triskelion or whatever, because Starfleet has a policy of some intervention.
Likewise, when the crew encounters the Pakleds, a species considered a joke by Starfleet based on their limited interactions in the past, they are caught off guard by the Pakleds' powerful warships cobbled together from salvaged ships of various species.
Looks like they're not a joke anymore.
The allegories to our modern society are obvious. Decades of neglecting socioeconomic tensions, racial inequalities, infrastructure, and climate change have left much of the world in a state of constant and escalating tension. This seems to also allude to the near future we see in Star Trek Picard, where a neglect of the Federation's core values in response to the Romulan Empire supernova catastrophe has left the Empire a shell of its former self, growing insular and discriminatory.
We withdrew. The galaxy was mourning, burying its dead. And Starfleet slunk from its duties. The decision to call off the rescue and to abandon those people we had sworn to save was not just dishonorable. It was downright criminal.
Likewise, Starfleet's bureaucracy and rigidity are often called into question throughout Season 1, particularly by the de facto main character, Ensign Mariner. If a secondary theme can be attributed to the show thus far, it would be the need to find a balance between knowing when to follow the rules and when to break them. This is best demonstrated by Episode 3, titled Temporal Edict, which explores the balance between work and leisure. Captain Freeman attempts to improve ship efficiency by eliminating so-called buffer time, that is, extra time the crew members build into their work estimates to give themselves room to have fun and relax, only to find the entire crew completely burned out and unable to properly respond to more important work.
Kills me to say this, but for the good of the ship, we have to loosen up.
Loosen up? But then we're right back to buffer time.
Yes, when people could do whatever they had to get the job done. You're a great captain. Let them be a great crew.
The idea is further explored in the season finale, when Mariner's constant rule-breaking and contraband smuggling eventually helps save the crew from being overrun, and Mariner's tension with her mother, Captain Freeman, is somewhat resolved when the two begin to understand that each of them needs the other to find the effective balance required to maintain the effectiveness of the Cerritos. This strikes at one of the most consistent dichotomies of Star Trek itself. The tension between being a vision of utopian leftist society built on respect, individuality, and freedom from oppression, but focusing on a rigid quasi-military organization with strict rules that must be obeyed, even when the morality of following those rules is dubious at best. And yes, I know the debate of whether Starfleet is really a military organization is contentious, but that's a whole can of worms unto itself. For all the ways Star Trek tries to envision a society free from discrimination, a running theme of the franchise is its continued use of stereotypes, especially for non-human species. Whether it's the militant inclinations of the Cardassians and Klingons, the greed of the Ferengi, the duplicity of the Romulans, or the stoicism of the Vulcans, Trek has a history of preaching individuality while simultaneously treating most species as a monolith. Lower Decks uses its format of fake-out jokes moving at warp speed to play on our expectations, only to eventually subvert them. This is demonstrated with the stories themselves, whether it be overwhelmingly supportive reactions to Rutherford trying out new roles on the ship, or Boimler's fears of being disappeared after a transporter incident being turned on their heads by the end of the episode. But we also see it applied to members of several species. Episode 2 spends most of its runtime showing Boimler struggling to apply his training about various cultures to safely navigate a diverse outpost without Mariner's real-world experience, before he eventually saves Mariner from being taken advantage of by a sneaky Ferengi, only for the Ferengi to turn out to be a friend of Mariner's that is putting on a show.
Ah, Mariner, was I convincing enough for you? Human!
You were perfect, Quimp. Thanks for helping out.
As previously mentioned, the finale shows how the stereotype of the Pakleds being a joke was wildly inaccurate, as they demonstrate the ability to combine incompatible technology from a multitude of species into a single powerful unit. But Lower Decks also takes the opportunity to show how the crew members can even apply those stereotypes to their fellow comrades. For example, during a holo novel simulation in Episode 9, when Mariner insults Tendi by casting her in a very stereotypical Orion role, until Tendi finally puts her in her place.
Come on, dude. Orions are pirates. Pillaging's your whole thing.
Okay, stop. It is not my whole thing. And for your information, many Orions haven't been pirates for over 5 years.
All of this comes together to create a show that questions many of the standard conventions and tropes of Star Trek, while simultaneously showing what the world looks like for the average Starfleet officer, and how the system is maintained through a balance of conformity and creativity. And while Deep Space Nine, Discovery, and Picard each attempt to tackle similar deconstruction of Trek tropes, they all do so in a generally more dramatic and often negative connotation. Lower Decks' speedy pace, comedic format, and deconstruction of tropes with generally positive alternatives makes it a breath of fresh air for the franchise, and a welcome balance to the dramatic and darker undertones of the other series in the modern era of Trek. But that doesn't mean that Lower Decks is perfect in its crusade against Trek tropes. Despite all its attempts at being a new take on the Trek format, in many ways it's closer to its pre-millennium forebears than its Kurtzman-era contemporaries. Discovery and Picard have followed the general trend of modern television production by focusing each season on a single main story thread, with each episode serving mainly as a chapter in a larger story. Lower Decks, on the other hand, sticks closer to the episode of the week format employed by most entries in the franchise. Season 1 does have some overarching themes and plot lines, but the same can be said of most Trek, for example, Deep Space Nine's Dominion War, Voyager's Borg confrontations, and especially Enterprise's Season 3 Xindi conflict. And combined with its sharper focus on less significant characters and events, there's little opportunity for the show to shake up the universe as a whole. While we've only gotten 10 episodes so far, nothing we have seen has had the kind of impact on the universe as the aforementioned Dominion War. And being set at roughly the same part of the timeline as Star Trek Nemesis, we're also not getting glimpses of new eras of Trek like we get with Picard or Discovery Season 3. Every week feels like a reset to the status quo, at least from a world-building perspective. Certainly, there's nothing as egregious as experiencing PTSD from memory implants of a 20-year prison sentence only to never be mentioned again, like Miles O'Brien, and our characters do seem to exhibit more and more consistent character growth from week to week than what we would see throughout larger swaths of the next generation of Voyager. But overall, it's hard to escape the feeling from one week to the next that little of what we're seeing on screen really matters much in the grand scheme of things. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Overall, I think the show's tight focus does more good than harm, but the safety of that decision stands in stark contrast to the risks that Lower Decks takes in other areas. But nowhere is Lower Decks' proclivity towards familiarity felt more than in its tight adherence to canon and nostalgia. Star Trek Discovery has gotten a lot of attention, probably mostly negative, for taking a lot of, let's call it liberty, with established Trek visual and narrative canon. From the Season 1 design of the Klingons, to the liberal use of holograms and reimagined Enterprise, to the introduction of a new Spock sibling, again, Discovery has made its name by challenging the Trek establishment. Lower Decks sometimes feels like a direct response to the negative feedback from certain fans to Discovery's liberal reinterpretation of fan-favorite designs, characters, and themes, fairly or not. Visually, few risks are taken. The uniforms look like obvious evolutions of the Next Generation, when they aren't just reusing those designs. The LCAR's computer interface is largely unchanged from Michael Okuda's 90s Trek design. And the ships look like they could have been kitbashed by Probert and Sternbach themselves. Narratively, Lower Decks tends to jump from one in-joke or canonical reference to the next, leaning heavily on a foundation of pre-existing knowledge of the franchise and all of its intricacies spanning over half a century and nearly 800 hours of television and film, even dipping into extended canon, for example when we finally see Captain Riker's USS Titan in the season finale, a fan-designed ship only previously seen in a series of novels. Whereas Discovery's willingness to take risks has added to the diversity of the universe, from characters to visual design to storytelling, Lower Decks often feels like a contraction. No doubt this back-to-basics approach has helped it to build a bridge to those discontent with Discovery, and to some extent the J.J. Abrams movies, but it's hard to shake the feeling that, in the process, an opportunity to embrace infinite diversity and infinite combinations has been missed. And this isn't the only area where Lower Decks' lack of diversity rears its head. After Discovery made great strides in correcting Star Trek's long-standing lack of representation of the LGBTQ+ community, Lower Decks feels like taking a step back. None of the main characters introduced thus far have been shown on screen to identify as anything other than cisgender and heterosexual. While McMahon has commented since the end of Season 1 that Mariner is bisexual and that this will be explored more in Season 2, very little of what we saw on screen in Season 1 hinted at this, and despite his comments that, quote, every Starfleet officer is probably at the baseline bisexual in a way, again, nothing we have seen on screen so far has hinted that any of the protagonists fit that role. And even if we do get some new information in Season 2, I fear that we will continue the trend of Star Trek series, and most media in general, ignoring the existence of asexual, non-romantic, and intersex individuals, among others. Sadly, this is a Trek trope that Lower Decks, so far, follows to the letter. But even aside from representation, it's difficult to ignore the fact that most of the main characters themselves are a bit tropey overall. The very first episode gives us an early look at how Rutherford fills the typical STEM archetype, incredibly talented and more interested in his technical work than romance, to the point of being unable to read obvious social cues.
No, I mean, what just happened?
I'm more worried about what didn't just happen. Failure analysis estimates the reliability of this mechanism at 1 out of 4.69 repeating. Oh, are you seeing this?
No doubt that this personality type exists. Tropes are at least sometimes tropes for a reason, but it's one that has become cliché in media and Trek in particular. Similarly, Boimler's character archetype of the rigid, nerdy, diligent officer leads Mariner to treat the idea of him having an actual girlfriend, especially an attractive one, as lunacy.
Here we go, log number 1,000,000 about girlfriend Barb. You know, I am sorry, but I'm starting to think that Barb might not actually exist.
Oh, she's real. She's as real as a hopped-up Q on Captain Picard Day.
Let me guess, when we meet her, it'll weirdly have to be on the holodeck.
Hey, I don't do that anymore, okay?
Sure you don't, man. But just so you know, I am still going to try waving my hand through her.
And while his girlfriend does actually exist and doesn't live in Canada, it turns out that Brad was infected with a parasite that makes him irresistible to potential partners. And while Barbara tells Brad that, as a Starfleet officer, she's above all that, it doesn't change the fact that she breaks up with him at the end of the episode anyway. In fact, it's difficult to name a main character in Lower Decks that doesn't fit a trope. Mariner is the impulsive rogue officer that doesn't play by the rules as direct response to her mother, who plays the role of the uptight captain obsessed with rules and regulations. The series does see each character experience growth in the first season as they attempt to bridge the gap in their relationship and find a balance, but it's unlikely that their core personalities are going to change much going forward. Elsewhere, Lieutenant Shax plays the stereotypical overly aggressive tactical officer, itching to blow up a warp core at any moment. Commander Ransom plays the hotshot ladies' man first officer. And Dr. T'Ana plays the grouchy chief medical officer that seems almost tailor-made to serve as a reference to McCoy or even Pulaski. The good news is that most of these characters do show moments of growth and self-reflection throughout the short 10-episode run of the first season, but it seems evident that Lower Decks is building its comedic foundation on its characters filling these specific roles. In some ways, this makes Lower Decks the most tropey of any of the current crop of Star Trek series. So, where does this leave Lower Decks on the battle of Trek versus tropes? Overall, in my view, the successes outweigh the failures, given the show's goals and the limited amount of content we've seen thus far. By channeling familiar settings, characters, and visuals, it appeals to traditional and long-running fans through nostalgia and an earnest attempt at being a fan-made love letter to a franchise that has touched so many throughout the decades, while also introducing those fans to themes that question the foundations of the very franchise that they love. And by embracing a new format and delivery style, whether that be the focus on new and or less explored roles within the universe, or the post-Adult Swim wit and animation, Lower Decks has opened itself up to a new audience altogether. One that may have previously been put off by the stuffy, overly serious style that stereotypically characterized previous iterations of Trek, even if those of us who have been watching for years know better. As I mentioned earlier, Lower Decks spends a lot of its comedic currency on in-jokes and canon references, which is generally seen as uninviting to new fans, but my personal experience has been exactly the opposite. I introduced the first season to a friend that has never seen a single episode or movie of Star Trek based solely on her enjoyment of Rick and Morty, and was surprised to find that she really enjoyed it, and the references served more as entry points to questions about the universe than they did as barriers. Mike McMahan and the entire crew responsible for bringing Lower Decks to screen should feel immensely proud of that accomplishment. So where will Lower Decks go in Season 2? The final few episodes of Season 1 seem to shift focus somewhat to larger overarching stories and more focus on the bridge crew than earlier episodes in the season. And if Mike McMahan is to be believed, we are going to get more of that in Season 2. It'll be interesting to see how the show strikes that balance between the Lower Decks characters versus the bridge crew, and serialized stories versus the through plots, and if the showrunners are willing to take even more risks going forward now that the series has established itself as an early staple in the newly expanded Trek universe. It's widely known that Trek shows have a tendency to take a few seasons to truly catch their footing. Most would agree that the Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and even Discovery all struggled to find their voice and build memorable, consistent characters through their early seasons. But Lower Decks stands apart in establishing its tone and creating a cast of lovable protagonists in just 10 30-minute episodes that make up its first season. And honestly, that just might be the best victory in the young entry's battle against Trek tropes.